Good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Okay. So I want to thank you all for being here at this closing moment and component of our conference. It's been quite the 2.5 days. I know Claudia went through a whole list of thank yous in her opening remarks, but I do want to say thank you to a few people. First of all, to all of our student volunteers for all the work that they've done, to Erin Spring for providing transportation between here and the residence, to our tech support, and especially, to Tiffany Sumich for her fantastic work in keeping everything running really smoothly. So let's give it just a round of applause. I've been thinking about having to do this, and if there's one word that keeps coming to my mind for me as a way to describe the spirit of the conference, it would be the word connections. One of our conference goals was to provide a platform to bridge disciplinary divides and to facilitate conversations among a wide range of scholars working under this large theme of controlling sexuality and reproduction. And so over the course of the past 2.5 days, we've heard presentations and encountered posters by legal scholars, historians, disability scholars, sociologists, anthropologists, folks working in health sciences, folks working in queer and feminist studies, and independent researchers. And also, a range of scholars from graduate students all the way to more senior and established scholars. And I've just been really struck by the connections between papers within a session and across sessions. I've been at so many sessions where I think, oh, I can think back to this one and kind of make links there. And so also when we began thinking about and planning this conference early last fall, we were also clear from the outset that we wanted the conference to be a bridge not only between disciplines, but also to be a way to build connection and collaboration between academics, community members, and the general public. And here I want to acknowledge Claudia Malacrida, who brought this vision to the table right from the get-go and who has held steadfastly to it. So thank you, Claudia. And so it was truly a delight for me to kind of pay attention to who was talking to who during coffee breaks and lunch breaks, and to see conversations happening between these different groups of people. And especially, I think, yesterday when we had our information fair and community booths. And for that, I also want to acknowledge Anna Olsen of SEPA, who was instrumental in bringing these community groups together. So thank you, Anna, for that. We were intentional, very intentional in scheduling the 4 workshops that we had to not overlap with scholarly papers. And I want to extend a really, really big thank you to HIV Connection Lethbridge, Reimagining Parenthood Possibilities, Connections Counseling, and the Right to Love group for all that you have offered our conference. Your time, your labor, your energy, your expertise and knowledge that comes out of lived experiences, and really for putting your bodies on the line in ways that I don't usually have to. So thank you to kind of disrupt and disturb our societal norms around sex and reproduction. So thank you for your presence here. As many of us know, there is a rich, As many of us know, there is a rich tradition of emancipatory knowledge production using testimony and performance to challenge societal norms, beliefs, and attitudes. And it was important for us again to include a venue for this creative testimony. So I want to extend a thank you to both Kathy Austin and to the folks with Cripsy for providing a fabulous evening of performance last night. When I went to thank Danielle and Lindsay last night, the only word that I had in my mind was how delicious the performance was. So thank you for that. So, of course, there's always things that can be improved on, and even though Claudia and I are like perfectionists and type A, there's probably some suggestions. So there are survey forms on the tables, I believe, and if you haven't already filled one out, we'd really appreciate it if you did, and we welcome your feedback. And I also want to remind you to pick up the call for papers and to seriously consider submitting your work for consideration in the edited book collection, which I think is due December 15th. So, the opening keynote that we had on Wednesday evening by Dr. Paul Lombardo touched on many of the themes and topics of the conference. And I really, for myself, I feel his talk really opened up space for connections to be made across the different geographies of this conference, academic, community, and artistic. And I think, so the conversations that we've been having and the connections that we've been making have been really rich because of that, and I think they're only going to deepen now with our next keynote speaker, Professor Dorothy Roberts, and it's really my true pleasure to introduce her. Professor Roberts is the George A. Weiss University Professor and the Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mossel Alexander Professor of Civil Rights at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, where she holds appointments in the law school and departments of Africana Studies and Sociology. Dr. Roberts is an internationally recognized scholar, public intellectual, and social justice advocate. She has written and lectured extensively on the interplay of gender, race, and class in legal issues, and has been a leader in transforming public thinking and policy on reproductive health, child welfare, and bioethics. She is the recipient of numerous awards, including most recently the 2015 Solomon Carter Fuller Award from the American Psychiatric Association in recognition of her demonstrated leadership and exceptional achievements. Professor Roberts is prolific. She has published more than 80 articles and essays in books and scholarly journals, and is co-editor of 6 books on constitutional law and gender. Professor Roberts' work is part of a long history of Black feminist activism and intellectual thought in the U.S., a tradition which resists singularity and instead foregrounds the interlocking nature of oppression, such as racism, sexism, class oppression, and homophobia that, in the words of the Combahee River Collective, creates the conditions of our lives. Her groundbreaking and award-winning books include Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, in which she explores how the regulation of Black women's reproductive autonomy serves the interests of white supremacy, and has shaped the very meaning of reproductive politics in the U.S. This book was my first encounter with Dr. Roberts, and it has profoundly shaped and influenced how I think about reproductive politics and reproductive justice. Its emphasis is also on Black women's resistance and activism. This book, while it was written in 1997, I think powerfully carries into our current moment and the struggle for racial justice that is articulated by the Black Lives Matter movement. In Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, Professor Roberts draws attention to the overrepresentation of Black children involved within child welfare and adoption processes in the U.S. She argues that the child welfare system is an institution designed to monitor, regulate, and punish poor families of color, and as such is part of a larger state apparatus of social control and surveillance. And I also think this book has resonance for the Canadian context and understanding reasons behind the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in child welfare in this country. And in her latest book, Fatal Invention, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century, Dr. Roberts examines the new biopolitics of race, namely the role of genomic science and biotechnologies in redefining race in biological terms in a way that kind of breathes new life into an enduring racial order. So for example, and this is a big issue on Twitter right now, the genetic surveillance tools such as law enforcement DNA databases disproportionately make Black people permanent suspects. So in this book, Dr. Roberts highlights a paradox. At the very moment that race consciousness is intensifying at the molecular level, it is fading at the social level, given the belief that we are supposedly in a post-racial era. And so one of the effects of this is to make racial inequality in education, economic, political, criminal justice, and healthcare systems appear perfectly natural. Professor Roberts serves as chair of the Board of Directors of the Black Women's Health Imperative, on the Board of Directors of the National Coalition for Child Protection Reform, and on the advisory boards of the Center for Genetics and Society and Family Defense Center. She is on the Standards Working Group of the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, and most recently has completed a term as part of a panel of national experts that is overseeing foster care reform in Washington State. More excessively, though, she maintains an active Twitter presence, and I would encourage you all to follow her at Dorothy E. Roberts, and she will respond to you. And then you can screen capture and brag to your friends that Dorothy Roberts has said something to you on Twitter. So in her talk today, Colonizing and Decolonizing Black Women's Bodies, Dr. Roberts discusses the history of state appropriation of Black women's bodies in the US as a means to maintain unjust hierarchies of power. Employing a Black feminist intersectional analysis to illuminate these mechanisms of colonization, she also points the way towards collaborative decolonizing movement strategies. And so I ask that you join me in welcoming Dr. Roberts.
Thank you so much. That was such a good summary of my books. I need to borrow that for future reference. And thank you for your warm welcome here, Suzanne. Thanks also, Claudia, for inviting me and for putting together this wonderful conference. Tiffany for getting me here, and now Erin for helping me leave and do some sightseeing. I've really, really enjoyed being here, and I think connections is a great term to capture this wonderful gathering. I've made lots of connections and also made, with people, but also ideas, and now have too many new projects to work on because of all the great ideas that have been generated by the discussions. So colonizing and decolonizing Black women's bodies, I know that there's a risk that this will seem like too narrow a topic for a conference like this, but what I want to argue is that in the United States, and I'm sure there are parallels here in Canada and all over the world, the appropriation of Black women's bodies to further unjust policies, hierarchies of race, gender, class, disability is central to everything that we've been talking about, and that if you don't understand that, you will never be able to solve the problems and end the injustices we've been talking about throughout this conference. So often the most marginal women are ignored, and the focus is on the most appealing women. The idea is, well, if we should focus on the women that the public will rally around and not put the most marginalized, least valued at the center of our agendas. And that has always failed. And I firmly believe that we have to understand how the most marginalized are so critical to maintaining systems of unjust systems of power. So I want to talk about it. I'm using the term colonizing, and I realize that that has specific meaning for the colonization by Europeans, especially of particular parts of the world, and they're settling in particular parts of the world. I'm using it in a broader sense of state appropriation of Black women's bodies, and to systematically punish these particular women, but as I said, also to help to maintain unjust hierarchies, systems, and institutions, and also to produce a normative citizenry, in the sense that punishing Black women is often used as a way to warn other women that they better not act like Black women or they'll be punished the same way. Do not be a rebellious woman who has the nerve to raise children apart from a husband, like Black women do, or you will end up being punished like Black women. And this happens subtly and sometimes in very explicit ways that policymakers will hold up the stigmatization and punishment of Black women as a warning, especially to white women in the United States, to that they better conform or they may be prosecuted for using drugs during pregnancy too, or lose benefits if they have children with out of wedlock. So let me begin with a very, very horrific story that just appeared in the Washington Post last March about an 11-year-old girl who was raped twice by men in her neighborhood who picked her up off the street, lured her into their car, and then sexually assaulted her, and then repeated it another time. And she told her parents about it. They went to the police, and she ended up being convicted for lying to the police and put in juvenile detention at age 11 because she reported these rapes. And in the record, one of the DC police officers said Danielle was convicted of lying. All sex was consensual. 11 years old. Parents are unable to accept the fact that this child's promiscuous behavior caused this situation. And I thought that what happened to Danielle encapsulates so much of the devaluation of Black women's bodies and the stereotypes about Black women and girls as being naturally promiscuous. The idea that an 11-year-old girl is promiscuous, just that statement, would only apply to someone who is seen as innately promiscuous, because otherwise you would assume that the 11-year-old had been victimized. Then she's punished for her sexuality, her assumed promiscuousness or promiscuity, and even though this particular case doesn't involve childbearing, I want to talk about how the assumptions of Black women's reckless sexuality is linked to punishing Black women's childbearing. And then the other very frequent phenomenon is that Black women, when we call for protection, are instead met with state violence. And this now has become more of a public issue because of recent cases of Black women who've been killed by police officers. This has been going on for a long time, but I think now with the recent police murders of Black men and the insistence that we also pay attention to the same kind of violence that's been inflicted on Black women, we're hearing the stories now that many of us working in domestic violence advocacy have been saying for a long time that when black women call the police, they are often met with brutality and even death. And similarly for Danielle, she and her parents went to the police for protection, and instead she ends up being brutalized by being held in juvenile detention. So the U.S. has historically and continues to have a policy of punishing black women for their assumed reckless sexuality, which leads to irresponsible childbearing. And there's a long history of it, which I don't have time to talk about today, but I wanted to just give some recent examples of this kind of punishment of black women's sexuality and childbearing. 16-year-old Rennie Gibbs in Mississippi charged with murder after experiencing a stillbirth. And some of you may have heard of the explosion of cases going on now in the US of women, mostly women of color, who are being charged with murder when they give birth to a stillborn child, or in some cases, attempt an abortion that fails and have a birth that doesn't last long and are charged with murder. Shanisha Taylor, one of, again, these are examples that make it to the news, but these kinds of cases are just routine in the United States. But Shanisha Taylor's case made headlines when she left her 2 young children in a car to go into a building for a job interview and was charged with child abuse, arrested, and her children put in foster care. There's another woman recently who had her children in within eyesight in a mall, and they were eating at McDonald's or something, and while she watched them during the interview, and the police came in and arrested her, took the children. Numerous cases like this. Ashley Del Valle, a transgender woman who was arrested in jail for wearing a sheer blouse, I think reflects many cases of black women whose behavior would be seen as just perfectly acceptable if they weren't black, but on a black woman's body, certain attire, certain movements are seen as lascivious and immoral because they are perceived as innately licentious. And so the same kinds of attire or moves or statements that a white woman might say, and it's acceptable, if they do it, it's seen as sexually immoral. And then, this was just mentioned in the last session on eugenics and nation, more than 140 women incarcerated in California were sterilized without required approvals, many reporting that they thought that they were getting a different kind of surgical procedure, or some who didn't realize they had been operated on at all. So in my book, Killing the Black Body, I talk about this history, but also some of the stereotypes of reckless sexuality and childbearing that support these policies. And if you think about the dominant stereotypes about, or just images about black women in the United States, they all have to do with reckless sexuality and childbearing. The black women's bodies are seen as dangerous and risky because of their sexuality outside of the boundaries of conventional norms, and their childbearing seen as causing social problems, both for their communities and for the rest of the nation. So the promiscuous Jezebel, who, this is an image that came out of slavery, and was a black woman who was supposed to entice white men into having sex with her, and that was used to justify the rapes of black women by white men, including their masters, on grounds that they were just lascivious beings who could not be raped. And the idea that a black woman could not be raped was part of, explicitly part of US law, but continues to this day in a de facto way, with it being much harder to prosecute a rape case involving a black victim. And also the image of sexual assault in the United States now is, with a lot of focus now on campus assaults, the image of the women who are survivors of campus assaults is almost entirely white women. And the one case that comes up involving a black woman is the Duke lacrosse case that involved a black woman, right, who the Duke and the lacrosse team claimed was completely making up the story. And so that case is often held up as why we shouldn't have stricter policies on campuses, because women lie about being raped by athletes and other men on campus. So the black woman is held up as the liar, and then all of the images of the women we should be sympathetic for are white women. By the way, I've been told that she was paid off. She didn't lie at all. She was paid off to drop her claims against the Duke lacrosse team. That's what I've been told by good sources. Then there's the mammy, who is the opposite of the Jezebel. She is not supposed to be attractive, so she is portrayed as someone with features that they do not meet the dominant white standards of beauty. She's darker, she's heavier set. She's always portrayed with a rag on her head. And she is asexual. So she's safe to be around white people. And so you've got this contrast between the innately promiscuous Jezebel and the who is dangerous, whose sexuality is dangerous, and who also at the time was linked to being an irresponsible mother. And then you've got the mammy, who is not sexually appealing at all, asexual, but also always under the control and supervision of the white mistress. And so she doesn't pose any danger, but only because she's got no sexuality about her. And then there's, there are lots of other stereotypes too, the sapphire, the matriarch, but I'll skip ahead to the black crack addict, and a myth that came up in the 1990s with the so-called crack epidemic in the United States, and an image of black women who smoked crack and sold sex for crack. So it was a very sexualized image as well as racialized image. And very importantly was the myth promoted by doctors and nurses and the press that crack had a particular chemical effect apparently only on black women, and only crack did this, that deprived them of maternal instinct. So for some reason, unlike any other drug, and any other woman who used drugs, crack had this peculiar effect on black women, so that once they smoked it, they were turned into completely irresponsible mothers, which then became a rationale for removing, tens of thousands of newborns from black women during the 1990s. And we had the phenomenon of border babies, where the hospitals were full of the neonatal wards, full of the so-called crack babies. Now that's the other half of this duo, is the crack baby, again, described as unique. No other drug affected children the way crack did, according to this myth. We now know this is all totally bogus, and we have studies, longitudinal studies even, that follow these children that show that they are no worse off than other children growing up in their neighborhoods who suffered from various deprivations, not because their mothers smoked crack, but because they were growing up in poor segregated neighborhoods with very few resources. But at the time, the crack baby, have you all heard of the crack baby? Okay, so you know the so the crack baby is a black baby, at least in the United States. The crack baby was a black baby. And it had these unique qualities, which was it was destined to become a welfare-dependent, a criminal that could not learn. There were these reports that hordes, and this was the term used in some news, hordes was in one newspaper headline, of these children were going to flood the public schools. And because of crack, again, some unique chemical reaction from crack that deprived them of their ability to form social connections. This was the myth. They were going to be uneducable and inevitably become this huge burden on society. And so this supported horrible punishment of these mothers, but also the view that the reason why black children were falling behind, or still behind, in educational attainment, had poorer health, were more likely to be locked up in juvenile detention, was all because their mothers smoked crack. And you see, it parallels so well eugenicist thinking, that the reason for social inequality is because of the bad genes transmitted from certain parents to their children. Here, this paralleled a genetic transmission, but it was a type of biological transmission of a negative lifestyle and negative qualities that these children were born with and could not ever escape. And the result was huge taxpayer expense. So remember Paul Lombardo talking about sex and money. Well, this was a sex and money story. It went from selling sex for crack to producing these children that were going to be a huge burden on US taxpayers. Now, part of this set of stereotypes about the reckless sexuality and childbearing of black women is that they were a danger and did not deserve any protection by the state. And so even when they were, like Danielle Hicks, the 11-year-old, were victims of sexual assault, they were punished, not the perpetrators. And this goes back to the time of slavery, and I'll just give you a few examples of black women who fought back against sexual assault and were punished or not given any protection. And this case, Georgia a slave versus the state of Mississippi, contains the rationale that black people are innately promiscuous and therefore cannot be victims of sexual violence. This case involved a 10-year-old girl who was assaulted by another enslaved man named George, and the court held that there was just no issue to be decided, because whether or not George should be punished was up to George's master. But the state of Mississippi had no interest in protecting the 10-year-old girl because she came from a race of people who were innately promiscuous. Celia was an enslaved woman whose owner raped her for 5 years from age 14 when she was sold to him. And one time he backed her up in a corner and she picked up a big stick and hit him in the head and killed him. And she had a self-defense claim, but was hanged for her crime. And this case was I just discovered on Twitter the other day, last week I think, Lena Baker, the only woman executed in Georgia in the electric chair in 1945, she had been routinely assaulted by her boss, her white boss, and killed him, and no self-defense. She was electrocuted. So I already mentioned eugenics, and I want to say some more about how this punishment of black women's sexuality and childbearing relates to the relationship between biology and biological explanations for how society works and is structured, and race, gender, and capital. And we have to understand that the way in which U.S. society, dominant society, sees black women is related to gender inequality, but also to a biological concept of race. The idea that human beings are naturally divided into races. Of course, Europeans always connected that to a hierarchy in which whites were at the top and blacks were at the bottom, closer to apes. In some versions of this, blacks were apes and not even human. I mean, I think we could safely say that racist, white supremacist ideology sees black people as subhuman to this day. But it's rooted in an ideology that supported slavery and colonialism, and it's important to understand that race was invented as a biological category. It is not a biological category. It was invented as one. It's a political category that was invented and claimed to be a biological category in support of racism. It's not at all that races existed and then people become racist, because they belong to one race rather than another. Okay, there's only one human race. But this idea that human beings are naturally divided into races means that women bear children into a particular race. So women's reproduction is inevitably tied to biological notions of race because they produce children that are automatically, immediately, must be categorized racially. And so regulating women's reproduction is critical to white supremacy because only white women can produce white children. You must ensure that white women only have sex or only implanted with sperm from, to make it modern day, right, with white men. And also, critically, during the very beginning of the US state, it was important that black women's children be defined as black and naturally slaves. So one of the very first laws passed in the United States in the 1600s was the law that said that black women, that the children of black women were black. And so that meant, for one thing, it meant that all those children that were produced by the rape of enslaved women by white men were black and could be, it's not just that they could be enslaved, they were born in the status of slaves, of enslaved people, which supported the profits of white slave owners because those children all were their property and could be forced to work for them to produce capital. They were capital and they could be forced to produce capital. So the regulation of black women's childbearing not only supported the production of chattel, human chattel, they were producing property for white owners, but it also supported the very production of racism and white supremacy, defining their children as naturally enslavable. Paul Lombardo said to me after his talk, he said, everything I said really is about race, but I knew you were going to be here, so I didn't talk about it. So let me just emphasize, and he's right. I mean, everything he said also was about race. And eugenic ideology and practice in the United States not only was geared toward producing races that were seen as innately fit and superior, but also materially involved regulating, punishing, limiting the fertility of black women. And so it's just so interesting that this, you could say, isn't this just about the timing of the Alberta eugenics program as well? It's just I didn't even know about that, I have to say, before I came to this conference. I learned so much, but the same thing in North Carolina's eugenics board operated from 1933 to 1973, only ended because a newspaper reporter revealed it was still going on, and then it closed down, sort of like the Tuskegee experiment in the United States. Newspapers find out about it, stops, but you've got these horrible, unethical, unjust programs going on. And in the US, and this is reflective of other eugenic programs around the country, but especially in the South, the victims by the last decades of it had become primarily poor black women dependent on welfare, and this was a measure to limit the amount of money that taxpayers were paying toward welfare, and also to prevent the births of children who were seen as innately inferior, prone to crime, prone to poverty, prone to welfare dependency. And as I mentioned, the sterilization of women seen to be burdens on taxpayers continues in various programs, many of which we don't know about. Again, if it wasn't for the work of Justice Now, this wouldn't have been widely known either, that over 10 years, the California prisons were conducting a policy of sterilizing incarcerated women. And note the way in which the doctor in charge of it, again, the same theme that looks just like some of the headlines Dr. Lombardo put up, right, from the 1930s, that this program was good because it saved California taxpayers money on the welfare payments that would have gone to all these unwanted children had the incarcerated women not been sterilized and continued to get pregnant. So one way in which the punishment of black women's sexuality and childbearing supports unjust institutions is by promoting a biological explanation for social inequality. The biological explanation being that black women's childbearing is creating social problems that keep certain people at the bottom, not because of institutionalized racism. No, it's because they are giving to their children a lifestyle of poverty and crime and dependency that makes it impossible for them to take advantage of all the opportunities that American capitalism gives to them. And one example of that is this op-ed piece, editorial in the Philadelphia Inquirer, the day after Norplant, a long-acting contraceptive, was approved by the FDA, which happened to be the same day that a study came out showing that most black children are born in the United States are born into poverty. And so the genius editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer thought, oh, let's put those two together, and suggested that Norplant was the solution to black poverty. If all you had to do was encourage or force poor black women to use Norplant, and you would end black poverty in the United States, because the main reason more black children are living in poverty is that the people having the most children are the least capable of supporting them. Another recent exploitation of black women's bodies and the image of black women as sexually risky and their childbearing as risky is the anti-abortion movement's use of the history of eugenics to claim that abortion providers in the United States are inflicting a black genocide on black communities, that black women are being pressured into having abortions, and that is a form of eugenics and genocide. And so one campaign was to put up posters in big cities around the country with messages like this: black children are an endangered species, and the one, too many aborted.com, and the one that I thought was the most stigmatizing of black women and insulting of black women is the most dangerous place for an African American is in the womb. That message comes straight out of eugenics, right? But was being used by anti-abortion advocates to claim that abortion was bad for black people. And this has come up again even in the recent videos that have been popping up periodically of Planned Parenthood staff engaged in transactions regarding fetal tissue. They've been saying, well, the black fetal tissue doesn't cost as much, and so that there's some special effort to pressure black women into having abortions so that their fetal tissue can be sold. A cynical is too kind a word use of this history to falsely claim that the reason why black women seek abortions is because they are being pressured into it. Now, that does not discount the history I just talked about of family planning groups using abortion and other forms of birth control as a means of reducing black fertility for racist reasons. That is a very real history, and I also would criticize the continued eugenicist arguments used on the left for reproductive rights. So, for example, the message that abortion saves taxpayer money. I just was tweeting, I think last week also, about a tweet that The Nation put out saying just that. Abortion saved, and it had how much money? Taxpayer money, as a pro-abortion rights statement, or that it reduces crime or prevents the tragedy of disability. These are all arguments that abortion rights advocates have made to support abortion. In my mind, they're all eugenicist, or at least eugenicist-sounding arguments that they're wrong and they don't do any good for increasing access to abortion. Also, another example is a push for the promotion of long-acting reversible contraceptives on teenagers in inner cities. These efforts are targeted at teenagers of color, and the argument again is that it's going to end teen pregnancy and poverty, that the reason for teen poverty and lack of opportunity is because they're getting pregnant, not all the other reasons, the terrible public school system in the United States and the structural reasons for poverty in their communities. And another example is recent calls to end the rules that were enacted in the 1970s as a result of the exposure of huge amounts of sterilization abuse of women receiving welfare in the United States. Hundreds of thousands of women who were sterilized under government welfare programs in the United States. That led to federal regulations making it harder, admittedly, to be sterilized. There's a 30-day waiting period in the United States. But some people are now calling for ending those rules on grounds that they discriminate against women on Medicaid. It's complicated. I don't have time to talk about it now, but we cannot ignore the reason why those rules were enacted in the first place, and those conditions continue today in the United States. All right. Now I want to talk a little bit about the way in which these stereotypes and policies against black women's sexuality and childbearing work to support unjust institutions in an interlocking fashion in the United States. And I want to focus on three: welfare, public assistance, prisons, and foster care. So for one thing, these three systems have a lot in common, and one of the things they have in common is that they're very punitive and they disproportionately involve black mothers. So black mothers are disproportionately recipients of welfare in the United States, and about a third of children in foster care in the United States are black. You know, black children are like a 12 or 13% of the youth population in the United States, but about 30% of the foster care population in the United States. Most have been removed from black mothers who are their primary caretakers, and about a third of women in prison in the United States are black, and most of them are primary caretakers of their children. So these systems are very similar demographically. They revolve around black women. Okay, and I'll say a little bit more about this, but I want to argue that their existence depends on this disproportionate targeting of black women. By age 14, 1 in 4 black children born in 1990 had an incarcerated parent, compared to only 1 in 25 white children. So this to give you an example of how racially unbalanced this experience of being an incarcerated parent and being a child with an incarcerated parent in the United States. Also, the overlap of policy. So the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, which was the welfare restructuring, basically the law signed by President Clinton. Again, this is not, this is a neoliberal move, it's not a right-wing move, that eliminated the entitlement to welfare in the United States. So welfare in the United States is a behavior modification program. It's just, it says in the preamble, it's to get poor women married and to stop having so many children. I mean, the Congress wrote that out in the law. It's very plain. And the next year, Congress passed the Adoption Safe Families Act, which speeds up termination of parental rights by courts who are adjudicating child welfare cases, with an emphasis on getting these children adopted and not returned to their families. So you have these two neoliberal efforts focusing on private marriage, work, and adoption as a solution to the struggles of poor families in the United States. And the first time that the federal government mandates that states protect children, including by removing them from their parents, without a corresponding mandate that they have to provide economic support for families. It is a major convergence of white supremacy and neoliberalism in the United States in these two laws. And who bears the brunt of it? It's black mothers who they're at the center of this in so many ways. They're the ones who are punished by it, but it was their images that fueled the passage of these laws. You know, the image of the welfare queen who went on welfare, who had children so she'd get a welfare check, had more and more children just to collect welfare check. That was what fueled these laws. The idea that black mothers were keeping white middle-class couples from being able to adopt black children, that argument was explicitly made in the United States to promote the Adoption and Safe Families Act. In my book, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, as Suzanne so eloquently captured it. I describe the child welfare system not as a system to save children, but as a system to destroy black families in a very systematic way. And just one piece of research evidence of how this happens is that it is now well established that it takes more risk of maltreatment for a white child to be placed in foster care compared to the risk for a black child. So sometimes people say, oh, well, it's because black children are poorer, that's why they end up in foster. No, there is racial bias in the child welfare system, the way in which decisions are made. And both are true. But the whole policy of relying on removing children is deeply, deeply embedded with racism, because, again, we can take these three systems, welfare, prisons, and foster care, all of them exploded during the period after the 1960 civil rights movement, as more and more black people became clients of the welfare system and involved in the child welfare system, they became more and more punitive systems. And you also saw a simultaneous expansion of the prison system in the United States. Okay, all of this is going on in the 1970s and 1980s. So they're political, but also, I just don't want to let the child welfare system off the hook. There's also evidence of racial bias in decision-making in the child welfare system. Okay, and then the ideologies, I alluded to this before, the ideologies that link them together, embodied in this image of the black mother who has this country club lifestyle on the backs of hardworking white Americans. Angela Davis said the prison industrial complex relies on racialized assumptions of criminality, such as images of black welfare mothers reproducing criminal children, and on racist practices in arrest, conviction, and sentencing patterns. Those laws, again, rely on black mothers, the image of the sexually and risky and risky childbearing black mother who causes the problems of her community and of America. And therefore, we have to have these institutions of foster care and welfare modification and prisons in order to contain the danger posed by black women's sexuality and childbearing. And also, the way in which, again, the reproducing a normative citizenry, the way in which it sends a message to other women to not act like black women and to not align themselves with black women. All of these systems harm all women in America, all women, even rich women. They harm poor black women more, but they harm all women because they lead to a regime that says to mothers, you are on your own. You're not going to get child care supports. You're going to, there's the threat out there that your children will be removed if you don't take good care of them. But the fact that it's black women who are the primary targets of this and who are vilified as innately producing children who are then going to go on to be threats to U.S. society, that marginalizes them from a broader movement that could happen to take up the issues that they are facing as well. So it separates women and it encourages U.S. women to rely on privatized forms of support rather than advocating for a radical change in the way in which families are supported in the US, and I would assume in Canada as well. Okay, I know I probably should have ended a long time ago, but I just want to mention one other aspect of this, just to be a little bit more forward-looking, and also to talk a little bit or mention some of my latest book, Fatal Invention. So, and this relates to what I was just saying at the end about relying on private supports and purchasing commodities in order to protect our well-being and our children's well-being. Well, the most high-level advanced technological way of doing that is genetic testing, which is being marketed heavily in the United States. You can, 23andMe and others, you can purchase these online and get the results online. And this was one of the promotional events 23andMe had in New York in 2008. And this couple, they were giving out free kits that, you spit in the kit and then you're going to get your DNA results back. And this couple joked that they were going to put off their marriage until they got the results back to see if they were genetically compatible. So in Fatal Invention, which is mostly about the resurgence of biological concepts of race, but I link that to the pressure on especially women to have genetically fit children by using these technologies. And this combination of high-tech reproduction and genetic technologies is being pushed more and more in the US. I think it's being pushed more and more globally. Now, it is the images surrounding are very white images, because genetic perfection, is seen in the US and probably around the world as whiteness. And success stories are lots and lots of white babies. I mean, this is so reminiscent of the eugenics era, right? The fit babies. So lots of them. You would never see lots and lots of black babies as, to promote these technologies, right? In the movies as well, even though more so now than 10 years ago, you've got on Craigslist, for example, solicitations for donors, egg donors from various ethnicities. But there still is, the images promoting them still tend to be of white people. Now, all of this is promoted as enhancing women's freedom, women's choices, and I just want to suggest that that is not true. So, for one thing, there is research showing that women who do not comply and use these technologies are punished. So far, it seems to be mostly just by being chastised by doctors. This is Brian Stock-Co has conducted more than one study of women who gave birth to children with Down syndrome and were then told, chastised for not having genetic testing so they could have prevented the birth of their children. And then also this idea that if you don't use these tests and have a child born with genetic defects, that you don't deserve any support from the public. And I've had students say things like this, but this was Linda Beck Fenwick asked this. This was a question. She has a book on the ethics, contemporary ethics of reproduction. This is one of the questions that she asked, and I think it's a question that reflects the thinking of many people in the United States, that women have an obligation to use genetic tests. And then, then what's their obligation? Well, their obligation is to terminate a pregnancy that doesn't pass the test. People don't like to talk about that, but that's the whole point. And I want to point out that genetic testing could become more and more part of the welfare state and the services that the government provides to low-income women, even though in the United States, fertility treatments are not provided for by Medicaid. You know, of course not, because we don't want poor children to have more children, so you would never, that would just be a total contradiction in the US to give women assistance in having poor women. But it may be different for genetic testing, because the purpose of genetic testing is very different from the purpose of in vitro fertilization and other forms of high-tech reproduction assistance. IVF, the purpose is to increase fertility. Genetic testing, the purpose is to prevent certain births. Medicaid won't pay for IVF, but it might pay, and in fact in California it does pay for genetic testing because that's a cost reduction, that saves taxpayer money in the end on those, you know, unwanted children that would have been a burden to taxpayers. It's a privilege to use IVF, but it's more and more seen as a duty on women to use genetic testing, and it is a neoliberal substitute for actually providing services and for changing society to stop discriminating against people with disabilities, to instead use these technologies that can be purchased online or perhaps provided by the government to prevent the births of people with disabilities. Okay, this is the end now. So I want to argue that not only is understanding Black women and the images about Black women, the punishment of Black women's sexuality and childbearing essential to understanding interlocking systems of oppression in the United States, but that Black feminist intersectionality is essential to ending these systems. And I just give a couple examples of some of the work that Black feminists are doing in the US. One is being leaders in the reproductive justice movement, coining the phrase, and also making reproductive justice a framework that challenges the rhetoric of choice and instead sees movement for social justice as essential to reproductive freedom. This is a campaign we always resist trust Black women that oppose the billboards that were going up in Black communities, the anti-abortion billboards going up. Another aspect is anti-carceral feminism. Many women of color advocates against domestic violence have taken a stand against the reliance on law enforcement for reasons I started out talking about, that very often women of color, instead of being protected, are injured or killed by the police. Also recognizing the devastating impact of mass incarceration in our communities. We are strategizing about, envisioning ways of ending violence against women that does not involve locking people up in prison. The Black Women Matter, Black Girls Matter, Say Her Name campaigns on Twitter in the United States that are insisting that we acknowledge the violence against women as well as the violence against men. This has also been part of an opposition to President Obama's My Brother's Keeper plans that are completely focused on Black boys without any attention to Black girls. And work on coalition building, seeing intersectionality not as a way of dividing people into different identities, but as a way of building coalitions among people in various movements. And this particular article I co-authored with Sujatha Jasudasan, who was the executive director of an organization called Generations Ahead. I was on the board of. It doesn't exist any longer, but we worked on bringing together women's rights, reproductive justice, and disability rights advocates to try to work through some of the conflicts and tensions, and instead build collaborations based on our shared values for humanity and justice. And so I'll just end with a basic premise of reproductive justice, that the struggle for reproductive freedom must be part of a larger struggle to create a more just, humane, and egalitarian society. Thank you.